Good evening, everyone. My name is Gretchen. I have the honor and privilege of leading the wonderful Utah Museum of Fine Arts, which I love even during these challenging times from where I'm sitting right now, my basement laundry room office. So not so glamorous as my usual office in the actual museum building, but I'm delighted to be here with all of you. We've been looking forward to this, to hosting Sarah. We're crazy about Sarah. We knew we wanted to bring her out, and I wish we could be doing it in person in our beautiful Dumpke Auditorium, but I told Sarah we'd have her come another time when we can be with her in person. But we're so pleased to have Sarah Urascreen, this wonderful author and art historian and curator and media host, with us this evening. So last fall, as Hillary mentioned a little bit, we at the UMFA welcomed these four incredible works of art by Thomas Moran, Georgia O'Keeffe, Diego Rivera, and Alma Thomas to our galleries, this long-term loans. These pictures have been with us now almost a year. And over the course of this year, their presence has really intensified our own efforts to present more diverse artistic visions of what American art can be and what it looks like at the UMFA, what American art stories look like, and the relevance really of American art to our communities today. These pictures have created lots of opportunity for conversations that are important. And we have titled tonight's presentation, What Makes a Masterpiece? And that is indeed the question that we've been thinking about since these four amazing objects rolled up at our museum. And it's definitely the question that I hope that you'll join us in thinking about tonight as you move with Sarah through her presentation. And don't forget that they are here with us until early October. So really, we're already in September. Make a mental note to get yourself to the UMFA. We've just reopened. We're open Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays from 11 to 5 p.m. So get online on our website, if you feel comfortable, and come and see them in person before they go. As the Fine Arts Museum for the state of Utah, we have the incredible responsibility of presenting art in ways that are powerful and meaningful for as many people as possible. And we know that our ideas, or the ideas that the museum chooses to put forward, are not the only ideas worth listening to and learning from. And we really want to encourage and elevate all voices, particularly those voices from marginalized communities here. And we want to create a cultural organization in which our visitors, all of our visitors, see themselves and their communities celebrated and reflected. So conventional thinking says masterpieces are works of art that have received great critical praise. But I think it's fair to ask whose perspective, whose praise, whose opinions, and whose criteria have been historically used to make those value judgments, and whose voices haven't we heard, who haven't we seen, and what famous artists do we not know, right? As we strive to be a truly inclusive space and a museum that is welcoming to all, we invite you and your families, your friends, your communities to engage in this wonderful conversation with us. So now it's my great pleasure to to introduce our amazing speaker this evening so she can get into it with us. And I'm really delighted to introduce you to Sarah Urascreen. Sarah is a creator, a curator, an art historian, and the host of The Art Assignment, an educational video series produced in partnership with PBS Digital Studios that focuses on the creative process and the act of making. Her book, You Are an Artist, brings together more than 50 assignments gathered from some of the most innovative creators working today. She is also the former curator of contemporary art at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. She holds a Master's of Arts in Modern Art History from Columbia University and a Bachelor of Arts from Northwestern University. Sarah lives in Indianapolis with her husband and 2 kids, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Sarah, and thank you so much for being with us this evening. I'll be quiet now.
Thank you so much for welcoming me this evening and for inviting me to speak. Like all things 2020, this was supposed to be an in-person live event and is now virtual, which is of course not ideal. I would much rather be with you all in Utah and be experiencing your wonderful museum, but so be it. This is life and I'll take it. And I hope that many of you, like me, have been taking advantage of all of the events at museums around the country and around the world that are now available virtually. I know that I have been taking advantage of that, and I hope you are as well. Before I share my screen and we can get started looking at some wonderful images, I just want to start by saying that this is a really challenging time for so many, including art museums, not just because of closures and its implications for budget and employment, which is very significant, but also because it was a challenging time for museums before COVID and before the national reckoning on racial justice currently unfolding. I think now more than ever, it's important to take a close look at our institutions and ask ourselves whether they reflect and promote our real communities and real histories, and not just the stories and trophies of those in power. I don't want to get too heavy too quickly here, but I think it's important to emphasize from the outset the importance of the question we're addressing tonight: what makes a masterpiece? It's a question that the leadership and staff of the UMFA have been wise enough to be asking before this historic moment. And I think they've posed it in a really smart way through this multi-year collection sharing initiative and through events like this one. I come to you tonight from the perspective of someone who studied art history, worked as a contemporary art curator in a museum for a number of years, and then for the past 6 years have made educational videos about art and art history on YouTube in partnership with PBS, as Gretchen shared. Through my series, The Art Assignment, which is available all the time on YouTube, and I encourage you to check it out. I have had the chance to reflect upon my time working in a museum, thinking with both fondness and criticality about the role that museums serve in today's culture. I've also had the chance to talk with wide audiences about the role of museums in life today, in the always interesting comments section of YouTube and elsewhere on social media. So my approach to this question of what makes a masterpiece is grounded in my deep affection for museums, but also for my desire to clearly appraise them and hold them accountable to the ways that the world has changed and is changing. I think by looking at the artworks that museums consider to be their masterpieces or their highlights, I think we can learn a lot about what museums value and their leadership and supporters value, both historically and also now. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that we can start this up with some images, because we are all here to see and enjoy art. So here we go. You've had the opportunity of having these 4 outstanding artworks visit your museum for a year, and I hope you've all had the chance to see them in person. But whether you have or not, I'd like to think together about this question of what makes a masterpiece as it pertains to each of them. The word masterpiece gets thrown around a fair bit as a way to express admiration for something. But what do we really mean when we call something a masterpiece? Who makes masterpieces? Who are the people deciding which artworks become them? Are they masterpieces from the moment they're created, or do they become them? Do they emerge from all parts of our societies or only from certain ones? I'd like to think about these questions together tonight as we look at these 4 artworks, and also consider whether masterpiece is still a relevant or helpful term, or is it just kind of an outdated hanger-on from the past? So let's see here. In its original use, a masterpiece was something pretty simply you made to demonstrate your mastery. Starting in the late 13th century France, artisans in a variety of fields would create a chef d'oeuvre, or a work of art that proved their competence, or not of art, a work of anything that proved their competence in the eyes of a guild and allowed them to take on apprentices. Like a silk weaver, usually early in their career, created a weaving that showed they could do all the things a master silk weaver should be able to do. Some guilds in England referred to these kinds of works as proof pieces and reserved masterpiece mostly for painting and sculpture. But the idea that a masterpiece was something superlative or amazing seems to have arisen at some point in Europe in the 1500s during what we call the Italian Renaissance, when guilds and academies started placing more emphasis on virtuosity. To be accepted by a Florentine guild or academy in the 16th or 17th century, a masterpiece needed to show not just quality or competence, but extraordinary quality. The term was often applied to architecture, but it served a number of fields, just as it does now. I mean, we use masterpiece to refer to pretty much anything done very well, be it a painting, movie, a meal, a TikTok, or what have you. But what's noteworthy, I think, is that when the word masterpiece originated, there were official people within guilds and academies responsible for making the decision about what work was good enough. And when considering what work made for a masterpiece, there were certain standards used to measure that greatness. And these standards shifted over time. So the word canon comes from Greek and means standard or measuring rod. The ancient Greek sculptor Polykleitos made a figure that this was modeled after. This is a Roman copy of the Greek original by Polykleitos. And it earned the, it's a figure of a spear bearer, but it was considered so perfectly proportioned that it earned the alternate title canon because it was the standard against which all other sculptures were to be compared. Many artists did try to live up to Polykleitos's legacy, and not just at the time, but centuries later when his work and copies of their work were rediscovered and venerated by the artist of the Italian Renaissance. One of the reasons we know so much about the Italian Renaissance and that it gets talked about all the time is because that's when many consider the field of art history to have been born. The person often considered art history's founder was Giorgio Vasari, who you can see here, the fellow on your left, who wrote the 1550 book, The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, which, as you might guess, is a compilation of biographies of the Italian artists and architects whom Vasari considered the most important. Vasari's intention was, in a translation of his words, to distinguish the better from the good and the best from the better. And his book formed what's been called a canon of artists of his time, like a best of or greatest hits list of the artists and artworks and movements that have been vetted by experts and, according to those experts, deserve to be preserved in history. And this idea of a canon in art history and in many fields has been heavily critiqued in recent decades, and I think for good reason. Canons leave people out. They're notoriously biased. They're created by those with the power to publish and distribute and influence. Vasari was an artist and writer steeped in the Italian art world of the time, employed by the powerful Medici family, and he did his research. And I think we can be very happy that we had him to record all of this material and learn from his experience. But do we trust him? Yes and no. I mean, Vasari, like anybody, had his favorites that colored his view. And we know now that he made errors and loved to embellish stories. I think that's part of what made his book so successful. And it did do very well. It was reprinted many, many times. You can still read it and enjoy it. It was hugely influential, and it created a kind of blueprint for how art and artists would be talked about for some time. I think to some extent, the end of year lists published by our art organizations are pretty much the same format Vasari rolled out back in 1550. But we have to consider, and Gretchen brought this up before, who decides this stuff? If we think about who forms our current canon or canons, I'd say there are a range of people and institutions that determine what artworks are good and worthy of our attention or investment. The media plays a role in this, of course, as do galleries, auction houses, art schools, art historians, teachers, collectors, audiences, and of course, museums. Your museum decides for itself and its community what work is worth sharing with you, past and present. They decide which works from the collection stay on view and which remain in storage. They decide how to present those works, in what order. Is it chronological, regionally, thematically? And they use the same group of artworks to tell many different stories. Museums decide which works to feature in their highlights brochures and catalogs, and what temporary exhibitions to bring in to show you what their permanent collections cannot. And they borrow works from other collections, like they have now, for a variety of reasons, to cast new light on the permanent collection, to fill gaps of what's missing, and to share works that are beloved in other communities and might also be appreciated here. And that brings us to the group of works that have been visiting the UMFA for the past year, including this painting from 1892 by Thomas Moran, titled Mist in Kanab Canyon, Utah. Now, there are many reasons why this is a worthy artwork to transport all the way from Washington, D.C. in a secure and climate-controlled environment. The artist is a very well-known and admired American landscape painter, best known for his depictions of Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon, but who produced a large body of work documenting the American West and also the Northeast and views of England and Venice, Italy. His watercolor sketches from his trip with a surveying team through Yellowstone were a large part of what convinced Congress to create the first national park in 1872. Congress also went on to purchase Moran's huge 7 by 12 foot painting of the Grand Canyon that you see here, which is now also part of the Smithsonian collection that the UMFA work on loan comes from. But Moran is lauded, I think, as you can see in this picture, as a master colorist who was able to capture space and light and the majesty of the natural world. He was strongly influenced by J.M.W. Turner, whose work he had traveled to England to see and to study. He was particularly taken by this picture for its masterful luminosity and also Turner's commitment to elevating the genre of landscape painting to the level of history painting. At the time, the paintings considered to be masterpieces took as their subject important moments from history or mythology and not just scenes from nature. So Turner's depiction of this moment from Homer's Odyssey of Ulysses deriding Polyphemus can be understood as both demonstrating Turner's mastery as a painter of nature and also ambition to record the so-called great moments of history or mythology or storytelling. And that brings us back to Moran's painting, because this is not just a painting of nature. He has included a small figure in this work, likely intended to be a Native American, a gesture that roots this scene not just in place, but in time. The region depicted in this painting was long occupied by the Kaibab Paiute tribe up until the early 1860s. Mormon settlers compromised the tribe's water supply, and they lost what's thought to be 82% of their population, mostly due to starvation. You can read more about this in an article that is helpfully linked to on the UMFA website. But even so, during the expedition through the area that Moran was part of, they interacted with members of the tribe and tapped them as guides. Here you can see Moran, as well as photographers of the day, were actively engaging in a kind of myth-making about the American West, capturing the imaginations of the many people who couldn't see these sites in person. This myth-making included stereotypical and usually inaccurate depictions of Native Americans and also idealized visions of the landscape itself. Here, let's go back to it. Many of you are probably familiar enough with the location Moran describes in this painting to notice that this is not a particularly realistic representation of the place. Moran said himself, "I place no value upon literal transcripts from nature," which is why he felt comfortable taking on this subject matter despite the fact that his trip through the area had been almost 20 years prior to him making this painting. And he never actually made it to this vantage point, but worked from photos that were shared with him. This was in the beginning decades of photography, remember? And Moran, like many painters, was showing people what painting could do that photography could not. The sort of mythical, mystical, poetic look of the canyon may not show you exactly how the landscape looks, but it might demonstrate how it might make you feel. So the UMFA has placed this, as you can see here, within a collection display of American and regional art under the heading Myth-Making and Truth-Telling for good reasons. And you're invited to think about these ideas within the context of other works from the collection. As you look at it, I'd also invite you to consider whether this painting is more of a masterpiece in Utah than it is elsewhere. I think a common perception of the masterpiece is its universality. The idea that a masterpiece is a masterpiece is a masterpiece, no matter where it's shown or who is experiencing it. I would say that this work is more important here than it is at home in Washington, D.C. And I would encourage us to think about other places or venues or audiences that might make for an interesting or intriguing or meaningful site for this painting. So moving on to the next work, here we have Diego Rivera's 1931 painting La Ofrenda, made possible through the Art Bridges collection sharing program. And Ofrenda is an offering, usually an altar or display of objects meant to honor the dead. It's a ritual associated with the Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, the Mexican celebration of life and death. And it was part of Rivera's one-person show at MoMA in 1931, in the very first years that the museum existed. And the show really demonstrates how popular and influential Rivera was at this time and throughout his life. Another aspect of the masterpiece that this brings up for me is acceptance and popularity. To be a masterpiece, it's often assumed that an artwork has received both popular as well as critical attention, and Rivera certainly meets that expectation. He was heralded in his day, as he is now, for his masterful compositions, his depiction of the indigenous traditions of Mexico, as well as its history and revolution. He studied in Europe and reinvigorated the fresco technique and created, along with others, the much vaunted movement of Mexican muralism. His work and that of other muralists was inspiration for the public works program of the WPA in the US during the Great Depression. And he really helped elevate the role and importance of public art in contemporary life. He was best known for his monumentally scaled work, like his Detroit industry murals at the Detroit Institute of Arts, as you can see here, and for his works in Mexico, like this History of Mexico mural at the National Palace in Mexico City. And I think in comparison to these works, the painting visiting the UMFA is rather modest in scale and subject matter. Masterpiece, I think, has also evolved to mean the top moment of one's career or the best thing you ever made. Magnum opus, Latin for great work, entered English usage in the late 1700s and meant that exactly. La Ofrenda is wonderful. It's a wonderful work and it's important to be sure, but is it the artist's best work or one of them? What I see more as I dig into this question, and we can see it here, is the relativity of the masterpiece, because the presence of this Rivera means more here in Utah than it might elsewhere. more than, say, at the Detroit Institute of Arts. From my collection search, I can see that there are 2 small sketches by Rivera in your permanent collection, but no paintings, and not really any that I could tell from Rivera's contemporaries. And if I'm wrong, please let me know, inform me in the chat, or in the questions following. I'd love to hear. But the UMFA has stated that the loan of this work, and Gretchen touched on this earlier, intensifies the museum's efforts to present diverse artistic visions and more underrepresented artists. And the loan also inspired a partnership between the UMFA and Artistas de Mexico and Utah, a nonprofit that promotes the appreciation of Mexican art in the state. Together, the partnership is seeking to broaden audiences, enhance exhibitions, and celebrate the artistic and cultural contributions of Salt Lake's Latin American communities. Excuse me. Estimates from the Census Bureau indicate that in 2015, 1 out of every 7 Utahns is Hispanic or Latinx, or over 13% of the population. Your state is becoming increasingly diverse beyond Hispanic and Latinx communities. And it really is the role of your museum to celebrate that diversity and to create content and experiences for all residents of the state, and to help foster cross-cultural appreciation. The next work, Georgia O'Keeffe's Manhattan, was painted just a year after Rivera's in 1932, and was also part of an important exhibition at MoMA that opened just a few months after Rivera's show closed. Here you can see that show. The panel that you have at your museum is the second one from the left there. But O'Keeffe was invited to create this work by the museum to be shown together with 48 other artists who were given just 6 weeks to produce mural prototypes for the exhibition, murals by American painters and photographers. It was during a time of a lot of construction in New York City, with lots of skyscrapers and high rises being built, that it was thought would need murals to decorate them. So the show was really intended to give exposure to American artists for these types of projects. The artists were asked by the exhibition committee to create 20-inch tall by 48-inch wide mock-ups of their mural design that was displayed on the shelf that you can see there underneath a large painted detail from the design. On the left here is a reproduction of the entire scaled down mural, and the 7-foot tall painting at the UMFA was the central panel that O'Keeffe enlarged and included in the show. She's known to have used as source material some of the photographs taken by her then husband, photographer and art dealer Alfred Stieglitz, with whom she lived in a high-rise building where they could take in the booming city around them. O'Keeffe kept the panel in her personal collection, and it wasn't known to exist until after her death in 1986. So we now know that O'Keeffe had indeed wanted at the time to secure a mural commission, but this work was never realized. She wrote to a friend in 1929, "I have such a desire to paint something for a particular place and to paint it big." She did receive a commission after the exhibition to paint a mural of flowers in the ladies' powder room at Rockefeller Center, but she withdrew after a conflict over it that involved her husband. But she did paint at a larger scale at other times in her career. But the Manhattan panel in question is a really wonderful bridge between 2 of her, at the time, best known bodies of work. She first became known for her images of flowers, and following that, her images of downtown Manhattan. And in the work at the UMFA, these ideas are brought together. There were many artists depicting the booming cityscape of New York, but O'Keeffe's take is unique, with her vibrant and imaginative use of color, her pretty unusual for her cubist construction of space, and her addition of images of handmade paper flowers from New Mexico appearing over top. She hadn't moved there yet, but I think many of us know that that she did move there and created so many wonderful works in the New Mexico landscape. But this is really unique within her own body of work, as well as within the wider context of art that was being made around her. And with this work, I can't help but think about how a work of art becomes a masterpiece. When this work was part of that original show at MoMA, it was just one of 48 works. O'Keeffe had cultivated a good reputation, but she was by no means the bold-faced name that she is today. Her husband, Stieglitz, was also in the show and was more famous than she. And many credited her rise to his prominence and influence. But of course, now she's one of few artists of the 20th century that many Americans could name. But it begs the question for me, is a masterpiece from the moment of its creation? Or is it dependent on its reception, an honor bestowed when other people or the right people recognize its greatness? Plenty of the works we understand as masterpieces were conceived to be masterpieces. They're ambitious in scale and content and technique, and they push a medium or a genre in a new direction. But other times it's not necessarily something the artist sets out to do. It's just a painting or a mock-up for a larger work that the artist holds on to and that falls into the right hands after their death. It's a work that is able to be displayed and loaned to other institutions and takes hold in the public imagination. Is this work, I'd ask, like an ascendant masterpiece? Is it a stable one? Is it star rising or falling? To a large extent, what becomes a masterpiece is unpredictable, and so is how long a masterpiece remains one. Our next and final work is Alma Thomas's Red Sunset Old Pond Concerto from 1972. Alma Thomas's story is a wonderful one and rather unlike the other artists we've discussed tonight. Thomas didn't focus solely on her art career until the age of 69, when she retired after 35 years of teaching art at Shaw Junior High School in Washington, D.C. She had attended Howard University and became the first graduate of its fine arts program in 1924. After that, she earned a master's in arts education from Columbia University Teachers College, and she painted part-time only while teaching. She pursued an MFA in painting from American University between 1950 and 1960. And she was really an excellent and devoted teacher. She organized lectures and outings and exhibitions for her students. And it wasn't until she retired that she developed the abstract style for which she became known. And she was really inspired by the visible world around her and the events of the tumultuous time she lived through. She created watercolor sketches to work out her ideas for her paintings, compositions of oblong brushstrokes like this painting, arranged in bands and patterns and shapes of bold color. Thomas was inspired by the natural world, as you can see here with the sunset picture, and she studied and made many works based on the colors, patterns, and lights she observed in her own backyard and in Washington parks. She was also fascinated, like many at the time, by space exploration and the Apollo lunar missions. You can see here her 1974 painting, Astronaut's Glimpse of the Earth. She had her first exhibition at Howard University in 1966 at the age of 75. And in 1972 became the first African-American woman to have a solo show at the Whitney Museum of American Art. So Alma Thomas is associated with the Washington Color School, and that's indeed how her work is presented at the UMFA. The Washington Color School is really a loose group of painters who were based in DC and who started in the mid-1950s producing artworks in a variety of abstract styles, but all exploring the optical effects of color. The big names associated with the school were Morris Louis, Kenneth Nolan, Gene Davis, and Thomas was actually not included in the early exhibitions that gave the group its name. Part of that was because she was just getting going, but I think there were certainly other reasons as well. The roster of artists grouped under that name of the Washington Color School has expanded in recent years to give a better and more complete picture of the work, the abstract work being made around DC at the time. Sam Gilliam is very much a part of that history now, as is Thomas. And while she was no doubt influenced by those other artists around her and was part of the art community of the time, Thomas really charted her own course, and only until very recently was left out of exhibitions and histories of this movement. So she passed away in 1978, and her place in art history has grown tremendously since then. Thomas's work joined the White House collection in 2015, the first in the collection by an African-American woman. And her works are now considered critical to any account or exhibition about the Washington Color School, or even in any histories of abstract American art of the 20th century. When the newly renovated MoMA reopened last year, Thomas's work was hung next to that of Matisse. So, this work that you can see here in your galleries, next to that magnificent Shakaya Booker there, this work and each of the works on loan is, for me, a reminder that we as communities are constantly redefining what makes a masterpiece. Calling something a masterpiece, I think, can be a really powerful action and can help protect and preserve it for future generations. What becomes a masterpiece may be subjective and somewhat arbitrary, but it can be really helpful. History books can't include all the artworks ever made. And when you walk into an enormous museum, it can be really helpful to be told by experts what to see, to have someone hand you a highlights guide and let someone else distinguish, in Vasari's words, the better from the good and the best from the better. But it's important to remember that as you look at any artwork, there are no rules for what determines greatness anymore. I think that is what makes art pretty frustrating sometimes, but it's also, for me, what makes it really exciting and open and fun. But with each of these works, I think it's important to ask yourself, what does mastery mean? What did it mean then? And what does it mean now? It's not just about, I know now, the way you handle a given medium, or it's not that way anymore. There's conceptual skill. There's the skill of restraint. There are still artists who make astounding and accomplished paintings, but more and more artists work between media, selecting materials and approaches depending on that particular project. There are also increasing number of artists whose work is collaborative and process-based and ephemeral. It makes the field of art definitely harder to parse, but it's also what makes it more democratic and representative of wider communities. The next time you're in the presence of art, and hopefully that'll be soon, I'd like for you to consider the standards you may be weighing the work you see against. Where did those ideas come from? And are they still valid? Think about what you actually value when you look at art and what you want to value. Is the art you like recognizable and safe, or does it push you in a new direction? I like to think about how important tradition is for me or anyone else individually. Do you want art that unsettles you or challenges you, or art that comforts or reaffirms you? Maybe, like me, you want art to have the flexibility to do all of those things. These questions are important because when we talk about masterpieces, I think we're really talking about what we want the future to know about now, and the way that we have understood the past. I think when talking about masterpieces, we're advocating for the voices we want to elevate and preserve. it's really history making. I know I've posed a number of questions tonight, and I don't expect you to have ready answers for any of them, but I do want to leave you with the challenge of considering for yourself what a masterpiece is and means and should do in 2020. What are your favorite works in the museum and why? And what role has the museum played in your determination of which works are the best? What's in storage that used to be on view all the time? What's been pulled out of storage that had been hidden away for decades? What's currently being overlooked that might be a masterpiece in the future? And probably most importantly, what's missing from your collection? And if you could keep just one of these loans, which would it be? Know that you are part of your museum community and you play a critical role in answering those questions. You can, and I hope you do, advocate for addressing the gaps that you see, either through acquisitions or temporary exhibitions or through loans like these. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to consider these works, these particular loans. It's really a wonderful gift that you have been given, this opportunity to experience these works on their own and in the context of your wider collection. And so I'd like to, at this moment, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to go back to it to look at any particular works. But I'd love to take any questions from you guys to talk about any of these works, any of my interpretations, if you disagree with any of them, even if you just want to answer the question of which work you'd keep if you could keep one of them. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sarah. What a beautiful presentation and thoughtful. And I got a lot out of it, and I know our attendees did as well. And we're so grateful for you joining us tonight. Thank you for your time and for your wisdom on this really important topic. At this time, I'd like to invite my colleague, Whitney Tassi, who is UMFA's Senior Curator and the Curator of Modern Contemporary Art, to facilitate some of those questions Sarah has asked all of our attendees to think about and to pose to her. Whitney will help address them on your behalf to Sarah. So please use the chat function or the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen to pose some questions for us, and I'll let Whitney take it from here. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. It's so valuable to have an outsider come in and share their perspective about the collection. And I did want to answer one of the questions you said earlier. You're right. We do not have another painting by a Mexican muralist in the collection. We have works on paper by Pablo Higgins, a local artist who was very active. And we have a very significantly scaled work by Tamayo. But yeah, you're totally right. We're very interested in addressing that gap with that loan. Okay, let's see. I have one question here from beforehand about the value of the term masterpiece today, and I think you expressed that at the end as you were wrapping things up. But I was wondering if you can. Today, is there still value in using that terminology, masterpiece, or is that term itself misleading?
Yeah, I mean, I think in thinking about sort of the word masterpiece, and I know that we've talked about this a bit before, like the word master is actually a gendered term. And has quite a history. I mean, master is used in many different ways. I have a master of arts. Many people have masters in other subjects. And to a certain extent, it just means that you have a certain hold on a subject matter or technique. But in another sense, it's about control and ownership that I think needs to be and should be questioned. I think masterpiece cuts both ways. I mean, I think it's out there and that people use it, and that it can, as I've said, like, can be a really powerful tool to lift work and lift voices. And, you know, if you decide that this really small and unassuming piece in your collection is a masterpiece to you, and you call it that, and you bring attention to it, that can be a really wonderful way to frame it. But I think, like I've talked about tonight, you have to think about who lifted it, how it's being lifted, and when that work is called a masterpiece, what is not.
Awesome, thank you. We have a question from Brandon. He says, the video game industry is now larger and more profitable than the movie industry and the music industry. If video games are art in addition to entertainment, what could be done with the medium of video games that would make a person of your background more likely to engage with and enjoy them? There's certainly a video game masterpiece out there. The UMFA should be first to bring it to a fine art museum.
Well, there are some video games in museum collections, I'll have you know. But yeah, I've through the art assignment, my YouTube channel, I've explored a number of different topics, and I have a format called The Case For, where I make the case for minimalism, or the case for Andy Warhol, or the case for, I've done a case for video games. And I'm not a gamer. I don't know a lot about it, but actually one of the directors and editors of the art assignment is really into video games and sort of presented all of the subject matter. And I really enjoyed exploring that. And I came away with a really deep appreciation for the intense collaboration that a video game entails, from coders, designers, sound designers, and also a deep appreciation for how collaborative it is with the person playing. I mean, you determine how it's read, and there are some really beautiful games. So I went about the subject matter with not a small amount of skepticism, and I came away pretty impressed. I still don't really play them, but I can admire them.
Thank you, Brandon, for that question, and Sarah for your answer. Brandon, I'll have to look into that for the UMFA. Send me your recommendations. Okay, we have a question from Diane. She says, just curious, what was the chain of events that caused Alma Thomas to become better known?
Well, I think, I'm not an Alma Thomas expert, but in my reading and understanding, and Whitney, please join in here, it has been mostly like, I think she got started later in her career, number one. I think a lot of women artists, and certainly people of color, were included less in exhibitions at the time, and it sort of took a retrospective look, sort of post-70s feminism, to really sort of bring back those histories and think about movements and who was there and working and important, but wasn't necessarily included. So there have been a number, I mean, I think even only in the 2010s, really, did her work really start to be included in a lot of like major exhibitions. Yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Whitney.
Well, two things. I was surprised in my research to see a couple of references to the support she received from other artists that were recognized as, the color school artists. And that, I found that was endearing. And then, of course, for me, I'm very inspired by what the Smithsonian American Art Museum did, because they have a whole ton of her work, and they got it, well before the 2010s, right? So and because she was there, she was making the work, and I don't know what happened to get it to the Smithsonian, whether it was a gift or a purchase. The Smithsonian had to have the vision to support her work, to care for her work. And now they have, the deepest holdings, and they can support the other traveling exhibitions across the globe at any time. So I think it's a great instance of a museum, getting on board and supporting a local artist.
Yeah.
Let's see. Here we have a comment from an anonymous attendee. Sarah, thank you for a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. Based on your own criteria, do you consider any of the 4 works you addressed this evening to be a masterpiece?
Good question. I really think it's conditional. I think they all could be. I know my personal predilections. If I think the Alma Thomas, I would sort of, for myself, rank that on top, just because I think that it, for a variety of reasons, is sort of the work that I would pick to reflect that moment in time, from the perspective of now, which I think is always sort of what we're weighing, like which works are the most masterful or display the most mastery for that moment, for that artist, and beyond. What about you, Whitney?
I've been asked that question over the past year, and I vacillate. I'm bowled over by the presence of the O'Keeffe.
Yeah.
It's very shocking. And Sarah, I'm sorry you couldn't experience it in person, because the scale and the energy in that piece is very, it's alarming almost, especially, in relation to the rest of her work. So I tend to answer with that one, but I mean, they're all phenomenal.
But could you imagine if O'Keeffe had actually been able to realize the full-size mural?
Or even the other 2 panels at this scale, like that. I mean, it's a shame. But yeah, that would have been amazing. And then that's unfortunate that didn't happen. Another question from Kaylee Crockett. Could you talk again about the significance of the person in the Kanab piece? You spoke about how the artist was involved Native Americans in his work a lot. Maybe clarify your points there.
Oh, I think he didn't involve a lot of Native Americans in his work. I think they figure sort of as small figures. I mostly brought it up to think about sort of like how a work is rooted and how a work sort of comes to be, and how your imagination is engaged. And I think that it's important to really look at it from the perspective of sort of what was expected then and what this work was intended to do and be, and for what audiences. I think at the end, I posed the question of like, what would be another interesting venue for the work to be shown? And I think, how would it be received for an audience that was primarily Native American? So, I am not a Moran expert, and I can't tell you how many of his paintings included depiction of Native American or probably Native American figures. But I do, for me as a contemporary viewer, it complicates, not necessarily in a negative way, my understanding of that piece.
Thank you. We have a question from Joy. Joy says, for installation art, would the criteria be different for defining a masterpiece, since it's more about concept rather than a physical object?
I think, this is what makes it such an impossible topic. I think installation art can be more about concept, but it also can be a very overwhelming visual sensory experience as well. If you've walked into a Terra installation, you've been overwhelmed in a sensory way, and it's not about the concept really. So I think that there are a lot of other aspects of being a masterpiece that I didn't touch on tonight. I think there is whether something excites you, and that is dependent on what artwork you've seen before, what you have been trained to think art should be in school, what your museum presents to you, what's expected or unexpected. And I think that's what you could call anything a masterpiece. So it's sort of a maddening and forever deep idea, I think. And for me in my work, I like to take sort of a generous tack. I'm not like a negative critic usually. I like to think about like, okay, if we were to say this was a masterpiece, how would we make that argument? And to me, that makes for a more fulfilling interaction with art in general, is to, you know, to say, okay, if we did really like this, why would we really like it? And I think it's fine to dislike things, and it's good to be comfortable with your own opinion. But I think for installation art, just like for any, you have to listen to your own response and allow it to happen. And if your response says masterpiece, then hey, great.
That's awesome. I'm always trying to figure out how to say what you just said in the gallery at the museum. Like, if you think it is, and dig into that more or not.
I also realize that that's also what I think alienates a lot of people from modern and contemporary art, because it, you know, you're asking more questions than you're answering, and that can be really frustrating.
It's true. Derek Wall has a good question here. Given the way that many museums have stolen masterpieces from other countries, how do you feel that those works should be represented? Do you think we should return a masterpiece that has been taken from another culture?
Short answer, yeah. I think that this is a big and very difficult issue for all museums right now. And it's a tough one. I know I was just reading about the British Museum's it's an endless, the British Museum's, most of their collection is extremely problematic. And would it be a tragedy for people not to be able to go to the British Museum to see these works? And it would be very sad, but it's also a tragedy that they were stolen, you know? And I don't think that all artworks need to be shown in their homeland, but I think that the history of how these objects were obtained has to be reckoned with. And if museums are really honest with themselves and forward thinking, they will demonstrate more leadership on that and try to anticipate what the future holds, which for me says works returning to their rightful owners.
That sounds right to me too. I'm keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A, and I see one more question here. Do you think museums should continue to perpetuate the idea of a masterpiece?
I mean, I like the way that you all have posed it, you know, like I think that it's a constructive way to think about which works get featured. But I mean, in a lot of ways, like all of museums' decisions about what to display have this sort of sense about the works. Like if you put an artwork on this feature wall, it's going to look like the work. If you put a bench in front of it, it's going to look like the one that you're supposed to sit down and take in. So I think that museums perpetuate it just by the nature of it being a selective display of art. You know, you can't have everything in there for a variety of reasons, and you have to make decisions, and very well-informed decisions. I mean, curators do their best to show you the best of what's around and what makes sense for your community. So I think museums play a role, but ideally they play a role, a cognizant role, like an aware and progressive role in sort of posing these works as masterpieces, but opening that to questioning. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone for your awesome questions.
Yeah, these are good ones.
I know. I'm gonna go ahead and pass the screen back to my colleague, Renato.
All right. Thank you so much, Whitney, for moderating a great Q&A. And thank you very much, Sarah, for a fascinating dive into a very hard and deeply philosophical question. The way you talked about all the objects and I can't wait to go back to the museum and actually see them in person. And that's an invitation for all of you to remember that these 4 incredible works of art by Thomas Moran, Diego Rivera, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Alma Thomas will be at the UMFA through the first few days of October. So make sure you come and safely come visit and see them in person if you are able to. And with that, we're gonna conclude tonight's event. Thank you all once again for joining us. This was a deeply fascinating and interesting event. Thank you very much. And one last thing, if you have any lingering question, make sure you send them to us and we'll make sure they get answered. Thank you and have a good night.